In the cold vacuum of space, where civilizations rise and fall like distant stars, there exists a universal truth that every species learns too late. Never underestimate the quiet ones. The Corvani Empire had conquered 17 systems with their apex predators, genetically engineered nightmares that could tear through starship hulls with their bare claws. They had watched entire armies flee in terror at the sight of their war beasts. But today, standing in the arena on Nexus Station, facing a single human female who responded to their ultimate weapon with nothing more than a gentle smile and a soft whistle, they were about to discover that some bonds run deeper than fear, and some partnerships were forged long before the stars knew their names. What happens when an empire built on intimidation meets a species that turned wolves into loyal companions? The answer would reshape the galaxy forever. The air recyclers of Nexus Station hummed with nervous energy as representatives from 47 different species filled the observation decks surrounding the arena floor. Ambassador Chun Wei stood in the center of the massive circular space, her hands clasped loosely behind her back, dark eyes scanning the crowd with the patience of someone who had seen too much to be easily impressed. The polycarbon floor beneath her feet gleamed under the harsh arena lights, unmarked by the countless battles that had taken place here over the centuries. High above, in the primary observation booth, Supreme War Leader Vextar of the Corvani Empire leaned forward in his throne-like chair, his four eyes fixed on the small human figure below. His chitinous exoskeleton clicked as he moved, a sound that had preceded the death of billions across the galaxy. The Corvani had built their empire on a simple principle: overwhelming force applied without mercy. Their war forms were legendary, creatures bred and modified over millennia to be the perfect killing machines. "Explain to me again," Vextar's voice rumbled through his translucent throat sacs, "why we are entertaining this farce." Subcommander Crix, standing at attention beside the throne, consulted his data pad with nervous clicks of his manipulator arms. "The humans, Supreme War Leader, they refuse all standard diplomatic protocols. They will not submit to our authority, nor will they acknowledge our superiority through the traditional trials of combat. Instead, they have invoked the right of apex challenge." The right of apex challenge. Vextar had heard the phrase whispered in the darker corners of the galaxy, spoken by species that still remembered when a universe was larger and more dangerous. It was an ancient law, older than the Corvani Empire, older than most of the civilizations that now bowed before their might. Any species could invoke it exactly once, a trial by combat between apex predators, with the winner claiming dominion over the loser. And their champion is this? Vextar gestured with one of his secondary arms toward the human below. Ambassador Chunwei appeared unremarkable by any galactic standard. She stood perhaps 1.7 meters tall, with the typical bilateral symmetry and soft flesh characteristic of her species. No visible natural weapons, no armor plating, no energy manipulation capabilities. Her only distinguishing features were the premature gray streaks in her otherwise black hair and a small scar that ran from her left temple to her jawline, a mark that spoke of old violence survived. She claims to be their apex representative, Crix confirmed, his voice betraying his own doubt. Intelligence reports indicate she served in their military forces for several decades before becoming a diplomat. However, her combat record is unusual. Unusual how? Crix hesitated. She appears to have survived situations that should have killed her. Multiple times. Her psychological profile indicates an abnormal level of calm under extreme stress. And she has refused all offers to view our war form in advance. Down on the arena floor, Chun Wei slowly turned in a complete circle, acknowledging each section of the watching crowd with a slight nod. When she faced the Corvani booth, she raised one hand in what her species called a wave, a gesture so casual and unthreatening that several of the watching aliens shifted uncomfortably. How could any creature be so relaxed in the face of what was coming? Perhaps, Vextar mused, his voice taking on a predatory undertone. Their ignorance will make this more entertaining. Signal the keepers. Release the Devastator. The word spread through the station like ripples through water. The Devastator. Even species that had never seen one knew the name. The Corvani's ultimate weapon, their perfect fusion of biological engineering and ruthless selection. Standing 4 meters tall at the shoulder and measuring nearly 8 meters in length, the Devastator was death given form and purpose. Klaxons began to wail as massive blast doors at the far end of the arena started to cycle open. The sound of metal grinding against metal filled the air, followed by something worse, the deep bass rumble of something large breathing. Chun Wei calmly reached up and removed a small device from her ear, dropping it into her pocket. She would need her hearing clear for what came next. The first thing to emerge from the holding chamber was a claw, a curved talon the size of a person, gleaming with a biometallic sheen that could cut through battle armor like fabric. Then came the leg it was attached to, a pillar of corded muscle and bone that moved with deceptive grace. When the Devastator finally stepped fully into the arena, the gathered species fell silent. It was beautiful in the way that perfect destruction could be beautiful. 6 legs supported its massive frame, each ending in those terrible claws. Its elongated skull held rows of teeth designed for tearing through hull plating, and its 4 red eyes tracked movement with predatory intelligence. Most terrifying of all were the smaller arms that emerged from its torso. 12 of them, each capable of independent action, each ending in manipulators that could operate weapons or simply tear an opponent apart with surgical precision. Bioluminescent strips along its sides pulsed with an angry orange light, and its breath came in visible puffs of superheated vapor. This was what had broken the will of entire civilizations. This was the Corvani's answer to any species foolish enough to resist them. The Devastator's gaze fixed on Chun Wei, and its lips pulled back from those massive teeth in what could generously be called a smile. For a moment that stretched like eternity, human and war beast regarded each other across the arena floor. Then, Chun Wei smiled back. It wasn't the smile of someone trying to hide their fear or the manic grin of someone who had broken under pressure. It was the gentle, genuine smile of a person who had just seen something that pleased her. She reached up with her right hand and tucked a strand of gray hair behind her ear, the gesture so mundane that several observers wondered if she truly understood her situation. "Well, hello there." Her voice carried clearly through the arena's sound system. "Aren't you magnificent?" The Devastator's head tilted slightly, its predatory focus wavering for just a moment. In all its years of combat, across dozens of worlds, it had faced enemies that roared defiance, that begged for mercy, that charged with desperate courage or fled in terror. Never had it encountered prey that spoke to it with the tone one might use to greet a neighbor's pet. Chun Wei took a step forward, still smiling. "I bet they told you I was going to be easy, didn't they? Just another soft human to tear apart for their entertainment." She shook her head, that smile never wavering. "But you and we know better, don't we? You can smell it on me." The Devastator's nostrils flared, and its eyes narrowed. There was something wrong with this human scent. Fear should have been flooding the air, the sharp tang of adrenaline and desperation. Instead, there was something else, something that spoke to instincts far older than the genetic modifications that had created the war beast. That's right, Chen Wei said softly, taking another step closer. You can smell the pack on me, can't you? You can smell home. Up in the observation booth, Vextar leaned forward, his four eyes wide with disbelief. The human was walking toward his ultimate weapon as if it were a statue in a museum. More impossibly, the Devastator was waiting, not crouched for attack, not charging with tooth and claw, just watching. What is she doing? Sub-Commander Crix whispered. I don't know, Vextar admitted, and those four words contained more uncertainty than he had expressed in decades. Shenwei stopped just outside the Devastator's striking range and, slowly, deliberately, sat down cross-legged on the arena floor. The movement was so unexpected that a ripple of confused murmurs ran through the watching crowd. She looked up at the massive predator looming over her, still wearing that gentle smile. My name is Chen Wei, she said conversationally. I used to be a soldier, but now I spend most of my time trying to stop wars before they start. I've got 2 children back on Earth, Sarah and Michael, and they've been bugging me to get a dog for years. Her laugh was soft and warm, the sound completely at odds with the deadly situation. I keep telling them we travel too much for pets, but honestly, I've always been more of a cat person. The Devastator's breathing had slowed, its bioluminescent strips fading from angry orange to a puzzled yellow-green. This wasn't following any of its combat programming. Where was the attack? Where was the fear? Why was this soft, fragile creature treating it like? Chunwei reached slowly into her jacket pocket and withdrew a small, silver whistle. The movement was gradual and non-threatening, her other hand remaining visible at all times. The Devastator tracked the object with all 4 eyes, its massive head tilting further as Chun Wei held up the instrument. This, she said, belonged to my great-great-grandmother. She used it to call her dogs back home on a little farm in Montana. Her dogs weren't much to look at, mixed breeds, mostly with more heart than sense. But they loved her, and she loved them, and together they kept her farm safe from wolves and coyotes and anything else that might threaten the livestock. She turned the whistle over in her hands, its surface worn smooth by generations of use. The funny thing about wolves, she continued, is that they're not really all that different from dogs. Same basic instincts, same pack mentality, same need for leadership and belonging. The only real difference is that wolves forgot they had a choice about who leads the pack. Chunwei looked up at the Devastator, meeting its alien gaze with calm, steady eyes. But you remember, don't you? Somewhere under all that engineering and modification and combat conditioning, you remember what it felt like to choose your pack. You remember what it felt like to belong somewhere. The arena had gone completely silent. Even the station's ambient noise seemed muted, as if the universe itself was holding its breath. The thing about humans, Chunwei said, raising the whistle to her lips, is that we've been part of the pack for so long, we can't imagine any other way to live. She blew a single, clear note. The sound that emerged from the ancient whistle was nothing special, just the simple, pure tone that had called farm dogs home for dinner countless times across Earth's history. But in the charged air of the arena, with 47 species watching in stunned silence, it carried the weight of 10,000 years of partnership between humans and the creatures that chose to stand beside them. The Devastator went absolutely still. For a heartbeat, then another, nothing happened. Chunwei lowered the whistle and waited, that gentle smile never leaving her face. In the observation booths, beings who had lived for centuries found themselves unable to breathe. Then, slowly, The Devastator's massive head began to lower. Its four red eyes never left Chun Wei's face as it sank down on its front legs, bringing its terrible skull to within arm's reach of the sitting human. Chun Wei reached out with one hand and gently scratched behind one of its audio sensors. "There's a good boy," she murmured. The Devastator's bioluminescent strips shifted from yellow-green to a soft, warm blue, and a sound emerged from its throat that no Corvani scientist had ever recorded before. A deep, rumbling purr of contentment. Up in the observation booth, Supreme War Leader Vextar stared at the impossible scene below and felt something he had not experienced in over 40 years of conquest. Fear. Because if the humans could do this to the Devastator, if they could take his ultimate weapon and turn it into a pet with nothing more than kindness and an old whistle, then what exactly had the Corvani Empire been trying to conquer? Chun Wei continued to pet the massive war beast, humming softly under her breath. She looked utterly relaxed, as if she were sitting in her own garden rather than an arena with the galaxy's most feared predator. When she finally spoke again, her voice carried clearly to every observer. "The challenge isn't over yet," she said, still addressing the Devastator, but clearly speaking for the benefit of everyone watching. "Because the real test isn't whether you can make something afraid of you. Any bully with a big enough stick can do that." She looked up, her gaze finding the Corvani observation booth with unerring accuracy. "The real test is whether you can make something choose to stand beside you when the darkness comes calling." She stood slowly, her movements careful not to startle her new companion. The Devastator rose with her, its massive bulk moving with surprising grace. Side by side, human and war beast faced the watching crowd. "So here's what's going to happen," Chun Wei announced, her diplomat's voice carrying to every corner of the arena. "My friend here is going to stay with me. Not because I conquered him, not because I broke him, but because he chose to. And together, we're going to show you what real strength looks like." She placed one hand on the Devastator's flank, feeling the power that thrummed beneath its biomodified hide. "Because the humans are coming, and we're bringing the pack." In 47 different languages, the watching species began to murmur among themselves, some in fear, some in wonder, and a few in something that might have been hope. The age of conquest by fear was about to end. The age of partnership was about to begin. And in a small maintenance tunnel beneath the arena, where the station's environmental systems hummed and clicked, something else stirred in response to that ancient whistle. Something that had been waiting in the darkness between the stars for exactly this moment. The pack was coming home. The emergency session of the Galactic Council convened 3 hours after the arena incident, though emergency was perhaps too mild a word for what had transpired. In the great circular chamber of Nexus Station's diplomatic wing, representatives from the galaxy's most powerful civilizations sat in stunned silence, their various forms of eyes fixed on the holographic recording that played for the 7th time. Chun Wei, sitting calmly beside a 4-meter-tall killing machine that purred like an oversized cat. Council Speaker Tichisura, her serpentine form coiled around her speaking platform, finally gestured for the recording to stop. Her species, the Thessarian Trade Collective, had prospered for millennia by reading the currents of galactic politics with the same skill their ancestors had used to navigate ocean depths. What she saw in that arena recording terrified her in ways that no market crash ever could. Ambassador Chun. Her voice carried the subtle harmonic undertones that marked her as one of the collective's most senior negotiators. "Perhaps you could explain to the council exactly what we have just witnessed." Chun Wei stood slowly from her chair at the human delegations table. Beside her, the Devastator. She had quietly begun calling him Marcus, after her grandfather's old farm dog, shifted his massive bulk to keep her in sight. The war beast's presence in the council chambers had required special dispensation and the removal of 6 rows of seating, but no one had been willing to suggest separating the two. "What you witnessed," Chun-Wei said, her voice carrying the calm authority of someone who had spent decades defusing international crises, was a first contact situation. The Korvani delegation exploded into chittering protest. Supreme War Leader Vextar rose from his enlarged chair, his 4 eyes blazing with indignation. "First contact? That creature has been the crown jewel of our war stable for over 2 centuries. It has broken the will of a dozen species. It is not some lost pet you found in a maintenance shaft." Chun-Wei turned to face the Korvani leader, and, for just a moment, every being in the chamber caught a glimpse of something dangerous flickering behind her diplomatic mask. It was gone so quickly that most dismissed it as a trick of the lighting, but those who had fought in real wars recognized it instantly. The look of a predator who had learned to wear sheep's clothing. "You're right," she said simply. "Marcus isn't lost. He's been enslaved." The word fell into the chamber like a depth charge, creating ripples of shocked murmurs in a dozen languages. Slavery was the galaxy's oldest taboo, outlawed by every civilized species for good reason. Even the Korvani, for all their brutality, claimed to conquer rather than enslave. "That is a serious accusation," Speaker Tetrisisura said carefully. "Perhaps you could elaborate." Chun-Wei walked slowly around the human delegation's table, her movements casual but purposeful. Marcus followed, his massive form flowing with surprising grace as he matched her pace. Every eye in the chamber tracked their movement. "The Korvani call him a war form," Chun-Wei continued. "They claim he was bred and modified to be the perfect weapon. But that's not quite true, is it?" She stopped and looked directly at Vextar. "He wasn't bred. He was taken." "Preposterous." Subcommander Crix jumped to his feet, his manipulator arms clicking in agitation. "The Devastator program has been active for over 500 years. Our genetic engineers created these creatures from base animal stock." Chun-Wei smiled, and this time there was nothing gentle about it. "Your genetic engineers are very talented," she agreed. "But they're not creators. They're editors." She turned to address the full council. "Tell me, how many of you have ever wondered why the Korvani war forms are so effective? Not just strong, not just fast, but genuinely intelligent. Capable of independent thought, tactical planning, emotional manipulation of their enemies." She paused, letting the question sink in. "Those aren't the traits you engineer into a weapon. Those are the traits you preserve from something that already had them." Marcus chose that moment to let out a low, rumbling sound that was somehow both menacing and mournful. The acoustics of the chamber amplified it, sending vibrations through every being present. Those with sensitive hearing appendages winced, while others felt the sound resonate in their bones. "Marcus," Chun-Wei said gently, placing a hand on his flank. "Show them." What happened next would be debated by xenobiologists for decades. Marcus turned his massive head toward the Korvani delegation, his 4 red eyes focusing with laser intensity on Supreme War Leader Vextar. When he spoke, his voice was a bass rumble that seemed to come from the depths of the planet itself. "I remember the before." The chamber erupted into chaos. Half the delegations began shouting questions at once, while the other half sat in stunned silence. The Korvani delegation was on their feet, chittering in their own language so rapidly that the universal translators couldn't keep up. Through it all, Marcus continued to speak, each word carefully enunciated despite the alien configuration of his vocal apparatus. "I remember the pack world before the small claws came with their needle ships. His eyes never left Vexstar's face. I remember the choosing time when young pack decided to stay together or go far hunting. Silence. Vexstar's voice cut through the chaos like a blade. His exoskeleton had darkened to an angry purple-black, and toxic vapor leaked from his breathing slits. That thing is malfunctioning. Its vocal modification wasn't designed for complex speech. His vocal modifications, Chenwei corrected, her own voice cutting through the noise with surprising authority, were designed to suppress complex speech. Just like his neurological modifications were designed to suppress memory, personality, and free will. She looked around the chamber, meeting as many alien gazes as she could. The Corvani didn't create war beasts. They kidnapped sentient beings and tortured them into becoming weapons. The accusations hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Speaker Teacher Cicera slowly coiled herself higher on her platform, her ancient eyes reflecting centuries of experience with galactic politics. These are extremely serious charges, Ambassador Chun. Do you have evidence to support them? Chunwei reached into her jacket and withdrew a small data crystal. As she held it up, Marcus lowered his head until one of his auxiliary manipulator arms could gently take the device from her fingers. The sight of the massive war beast handling something so delicate with such care sent a collective shiver through the watching delegations. This, Chenwei said as Marcus carefully inserted the crystal into his own data port, contains the suppressed memories of every devastator currently in Corvani service. Marcus helped me compile it during our 3-hour conversation in the holding cells. The holographic display at the center of the chamber flickered to life, and suddenly the council was looking at a world they had never seen before. Rolling grasslands stretched to the horizon, broken by massive trees that seemed to touch the sky. In the distance, herds of creatures moved across the plains. Not the random wanderings of mere animals, but the organized migrations of beings with purpose and intelligence. And running among them, working with them, were the creatures that would one day be called devastators. The Kithra, Marcus's voice provided narration for the scenes flickering before them. That was our name for ourselves. The shepherds of the herds. We were guardians, partners, friends. The hologram shifted, showing a Kithran settlement. The structures were organic, grown rather than built, integrated seamlessly with the natural landscape. Young Kithra played in groups, their movements already showing the coordination that would make them such effective pack hunters. Adults tended vast herds of herbivorous creatures, guiding them with a combination of instinct and intelligence that spoke to millions of years of evolution. They had a civilization, Chunwei said quietly. Not like ours, not like yours, but a civilization nonetheless. They had art, literature, philosophy. They had families. The hologram showed a young Kithra, barely larger than a human child, playing with its littermates while an adult watched protectively. The resemblance to Marcus was unmistakable, though this creature's bioluminescent strips pulsed with soft blues and greens instead of the angry orange of war conditioning. We were chosen during the first hunt time, Marcus continued, his voice growing heavier with each word. The small claws came in their needle ships when we were learning to choose the pack. They took the strongest, the smartest, the ones who led the others. The hologram changed again, showing Corvani ships descending from orbit like metallic locusts. What followed was systematically too brutal to watch, but the message was clear. This wasn't conquest, it was harvesting. The Corvani had specifically targeted the Kithra's most promising youth, separating them from their families and their world. the modification process, Chun Wei said, her diplomatic mask finally, slipping to reveal the raw anger beneath, takes approximately 50 standard years. Genetic alteration to enhance aggression and suppress empathy. Neurological conditioning to erase memory and personality. Psychological torture to break pack bonds and create dependence on their handlers. She looked directly at Vextar. By the time a Devastator enters service, there's barely enough of the original mind left to suffer. The hologram shifted one final time, showing a medical bay where creatures that had once been young Kithra lay strapped to operating tables while Corvani technicians worked on their exposed brains. The sight was so horrific that several council members had to look away. Until today, Marcus said, his voice stronger now, as if speaking these truths was restoring something that had been lost. When the pack caller sang the old song, and we remembered who we were before, Chun Wei looked around the chamber, reading the expressions on faces that spanned a dozen different evolutionary paths. Horror, revulsion, and underneath it all, a growing anger that threatened to boil over into something the galaxy hadn't seen in generations. The whistle, she said simply, wasn't magic. It was just a sound that triggered memories so deep that even 50 years of torture couldn't erase them completely. The sound of someone calling the pack home. Supreme War Leader Vextar had gone completely silent, his four eyes fixed on the holographic display as it cycled through the evidence of his people's crimes. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. This changes nothing. The Kithra are extinct. Their world is a mining operation now. These devastators are all that remain of a failed species. They serve the Empire, or they serve no one. The temperature in the chamber seemed to drop 10 degrees. Chun Wei turned to face the Corvani leader, and when she spoke, her voice carried the cold promise of someone who had never learned to make idle threats. "You're wrong about two things," she said quietly. "First, the Kithra aren't extinct. Marcus has been in contact with the others ever since he regained his memories. All 47 Devastators in your service are awake now, and they're very interested in going home." She took a step closer to the Corvani delegation, and Marcus moved with her, his massive presence suddenly, feeling far more threatening than it had before. "And second," she continued, "you seem to be under the impression that humans are here to ask for your permission." The lights in the chamber suddenly flickered, then dimmed to emergency levels. In the darkness, new sounds emerged, the hum of ship engines, the whine of weapons charging, and underneath it all a sound that made every being in the chamber freeze. Howling, but not the savage howl of wild predators. This was something else entirely, the coordinated call of pack hunters who had found their prey. When the lights came back up, Chun Wei was smiling again. But this time, there was nothing gentle about it all. "Ladies, gentlemen, and distinguished beings," she said, her diplomat's voice perfectly calm despite the chaos erupting in the corridors outside. "I'd like to formally introduce you to the rest of the pack." Through the great windows of the council chamber, the watching delegations could see the darkness of space filled with lights. Ships, hundreds of them, ranging from massive dreadnoughts to small fighters, all bearing the simple blue and white insignia of the human colonial authority. But that wasn't what made the blood freeze in their veins. It was the fact that each ship seemed to be accompanied by something else, something organic, something that moved through the vacuum of space with the grace of creatures born to hunt between the stars. Marcus raised his massive head and let out a sound that was part roar, part song, and entirely joyful. His pack had come to take him home, and they had brought friends. Admiral Sarah Martinez stood on the bridge of the HCS Fenrir, watching through the massive viewport as Nexus Station grew larger against the starfield. Her weathered hands gripped the railing with the steady confidence of someone who had commanded fleets through 3 different wars, but her dark eyes, so similar to her sister's, held a mixture of pride and barely contained fury. "Admiral," Communications Officer Torres called from his station, "we're receiving multiple hails from station control. They're demanding to know our intentions and requesting permission to board. Tell them," the Admiral said without turning from the viewport, "that we're here for a family reunion." And Torres. She finally looked back at her crew, her smile sharp enough to cut diamond. "Make sure they understand that we brought the whole family tree." The Fenrir was humanity's newest dreadnought. 2 kilometers of cutting-edge technology wrapped around a crew that had volunteered for what their superiors had called a diplomatic suicide mission. But as Admiral Martinez watched the creatures that accompanied her fleet dance through the void around them, she couldn't help but think that their superiors had fundamentally misunderstood what they were dealing with. The beings moving alongside her ships weren't pets, weren't weapons, weren't even really allies in the traditional sense. They were family. And family, as every human learned eventually, would follow you straight into hell if they thought you needed them there. "Commander Singh," she called to her tactical officer, "status report on our companions." Singh, a tall Sikh man whose calm demeanor had seen him through battles that broke lesser officers, consulted his displays with the practiced efficiency of decades in service. "All pack leaders report ready, Admiral. The Shepherds are maintaining formation around our heavy cruisers. The Hunters have taken point and flank positions, and the Guardians are staying close to our support vessels." "And the Kithara?" Singh's expression softened slightly. "All 47 are awake and eager to be reunited with their pack brother. The integration process has been remarkable. It's like they've been waiting for this moment their entire lives." Which, Admiral Martinez reflected, they probably had been. The files her sister had transmitted from Nexus Station painted a picture of systematic torture and enslavement that had kept her awake for the entire journey to the neutral zone. The idea that any species could take sentient children and break them into weapons made her stomach turn, and made her very grateful that humanity had found better partners. "Ma'am," Torres called again, "we're getting a priority transmission from the station. It's Ambassador Chun. Put her through." The main display flickered, and Chun Wei's face appeared, looking remarkably composed for someone who had just triggered what might be the largest diplomatic crisis in galactic history. Behind her, Admiral Martinez could see what appeared to be a council chamber filled with very agitated aliens. "Hello, Sarah," Chun Wei said with a slight smile. "Thanks for coming so quickly. Like I was going to miss my little sister's first attempt at starting an interstellar war." Admiral Martinez replied. "How are you holding up down there?" "Oh, the usual diplomatic chaos, plus one very confused war beast who's having an identity crisis." Chun Wei's expression grew serious. "Marcus has been sharing memories with me through his neural link. Sarah, what they did to these people, it's worse than our worst estimates. I know. We got 47 more of them up here who are remembering things they thought were lost forever." Admiral Martinez's voice hardened. "The Corvani are going to answer for this." "Actually," Chun Wei said, glancing over her shoulder at something off-screen, "I think they're about to answer for it right now." "Hold on." The transmission was suddenly filled with the sound of shouting, and the camera view swayed as Chun Wei turned to look at something behind her. When she turned back, her diplomat's mask had slipped just enough to show the warrior underneath. "The Corvani just declared martial law on the station," she said quickly. "They're claiming the human fleet is an invasion force, and demanding that the Council authorize their defense squadrons to the transmission cutoff. Admiral Chamartinez stared at the blank screen for exactly 3 seconds, then turned to her crew with the kind of smile that had made enemy admirals across the galaxy wake up in cold sweats. "Well," she said conversationally, "I suppose that settles the question of whether this was going to be a diplomatic mission." She activated the fleet-wide communications channel. "All ships, this is Admiral Chamartinez. The Corvani have just made a very serious mistake. They've threatened my sister." She paused, letting that sink in. Every human in her fleet had volunteered for this mission, knowing that it might mean war with one of the galaxy's most feared empires. But they had also grown up with stories of humanity's partnerships, of the bonds that made their species stronger than the sum of their parts. "Pack leaders, report," she continued. The response came not through the communication system, but through the neural links that connected every human ship with their companions. Admiral Chamartinez felt them as much as heard them. The steady determination of the shepherds, the eager anticipation of the hunters, the protective fury of the guardians. And underneath it all, the wild joy of the Kithara as they finally, after decades of enslavement, prepare to hunt as a pack once more. "This is Echo 7, came the voice of Captain Morrison from the destroyer Anubis. "My pack is ready to dance." "Bravo Squadron reporting." Captain Petrov's voice crackled with static and suppressed laughter. The shepherds are practically vibrating with excitement. "I think they've been looking forward to this." "Guardian Pack Alpha." Commander Washington's voice was steady as bedrock. "We've got your back, Admiral." Admiral Chamartinez felt a familiar warmth spread through her chest. The same feeling she'd experienced the first time she'd bonded with a ship's companion, 20 years ago on the colony world of New Geneva. It was the feeling of being part of something larger than yourself, something that made the impossible feel merely difficult. "All right, family," she said, her voice carrying to every human crew member and every companion creature in the fleet. "Let's go get our people back." The fleet moved as one organism, ships and their companions flowing through space with a coordination that defied traditional military doctrine. The Corvani had built their tactics around the assumption that every ship was an island, every battle a contest between individual units of force and firepower. They had never fought an enemy that moved like a pack. Nexus Station's defense grid came alive as the human fleet approached, point defense systems tracking targets while the station's main guns swiveled to bear on the largest threats. The Corvani commanders had clearly decided that their best chance was to destroy the human fleet quickly, before whatever diplomatic crisis Chen Wei had created could spread further. It was a reasonable strategy. It was also completely wrong. The first wave of defense fire lanced out toward the approaching human ships, coherent energy beams, and kinetic projectiles designed to cripple or destroy anything within range. For a moment, it looked like the attack would connect. The human ships were too close, moving too slowly to avoid the incoming fire. Then the pack moved. The creatures accompanying the human fleet weren't ships in any conventional sense. They were something evolution had never intended, but humanity had somehow made possible. Living beings that had adapted to survive in the vacuum of space. Some were descendants of Earth's great whales, their massive forms protected by bioengineered hide that could withstand cosmic radiation and micrometeorites. Others were clearly artificial constructs, but artificial in the way that a sword was artificial, purpose-built, and perfectly suited to their function. They moved between the human ships and the incoming fire with liquid grace, their bodies absorbing energy blasts that would have crippled conventional vessels. Where the defensive fire was too powerful to absorb, they simply weren't there anymore. dodging with reflexes that made computer-guided systems look sluggish by comparison. My God, breath navigation officer par from her station. Look at the move. Admiral Martinez was looking. She was watching creatures that her species had befriended, trained with, lived alongside, and loved, putting themselves in harm's way to protect the ships they had chosen to accompany. It was beautiful and terrible and humbling all at once. All ships, she said, her voice carrying the authority of decades of command. Return fire. Disable only. We're not here to destroy the station. We're here to liberate our family. The human response was measured and precise. Instead of the overwhelming salvos that the Corvani expected, the fleet targeted specific systems, weapons arrays, shield generators, communication relays. It was the kind of surgical strike that required perfect coordination between dozens of ships, the kind of coordination that was only possible when every unit trusted every other unit completely. Within minutes, Nexus Station's defenses were dark. Hull breach on Deck 7, came a report from one of the cruisers. Guardian Pack moving to assist with emergency sealing. This is FINRA actual, Admiral Martinez said into her communicator. All teams report ready for boarding action. Remember, we're not here to conquer anything. We're here to bring our people home. The boarding pods launched simultaneously from a dozen ships, small craft designed to carry human pack pairs through the vacuum to their targets. As they approached the station's docking bays, Admiral Martinez could see Corvani Defense forces mobilizing to repel boarders. What they couldn't see were the creatures that had detached from the main pack and were already moving through the station's superstructure, beings that had evolved to hunt in environments that would kill most sentient species, now moving through maintenance shafts and service corridors with the patience of born predators. The Corvani were about to learn the difference between fighting an army and fighting a pack. But the real surprise was yet to come. Deep in the station's detention levels, in a cell that had been specifically designed to hold dangerous political prisoners, Ambassador Chun Wei sat cross-legged on the floor with Marcus beside her, his massive form somehow managing to fit in the confined space. Around them, 46 other cells had been hastily converted to hold the rest of the Kithara who had been awakened by her whistle. The sounds of battle echoed through the corridors above, but Chun Wei remained calm. She had been in enough wars to recognize the difference between random violence and coordinated action. Her sister's fleet wasn't here to destroy. They were here to rescue. And that meant she needed to be ready to move when the moment came. Marcus, she said quietly, how are the others doing? The massive war beast, she was having trouble thinking of him that way now that she knew his real story, turned one of his 4 eyes toward her. His bioluminescent strips pulsed in a pattern she was beginning to recognize as contentment. The pack remembers the old songs now, he rumbled. We remember the hunt together, the protect family, the choose to stand. His great head tilted slightly. We remember why we loved. Chun Wei felt her throat tighten. In all her years as a diplomat, dealing with conflicts that spanned light years and affected billions of lives, she had never encountered anything quite like this. The Kithara weren't just victims of war. They were living proof that some bonds were stronger than any force the universe could throw at them. And now, she asked, Marcus's bioluminescent strips shifted to a new pattern, one that Chun Wei suspected meant anticipation. Now we hunt together with the pack that chose us. We hunt for freedom, for home, for family. His massive head swung toward the cell door. And the small claws will learn what happens when you take cubs from their mothers. The lights flickered, and Chun Wei could hear the distinctive whine of energy weapons being fired somewhere above them. The rescue operation had begun. She reached into her jacket and pulled out the silver whistle again, feeling its familiar weight in her palm. When she lifted it to her lips this time, she wasn't calling for rescue. She was calling the pack to hunt. The single, clear note echoed through the detention level, and 47 voices answered with a sound that made the station's hull ring like a bell. The family reunion was about to begin. The maintenance shafts of Nexus Station had been designed to accommodate a wide variety of alien physiologies, from the diminutive Pixie-class engineers of the Tersani Republic to the massive bulk loaders of the Garonian Trade Federation. What they had not been designed for was something like Vera. Sergeant Mike Reynolds of the Human Colonial Marines crawled through the narrow access tunnel, following the rhythmic scraping sounds ahead of him that marked his companion's passage through the station's guts. At 60 kilograms, Reynolds was considered large for a Marine. The Corps had long ago learned that smaller operators were more versatile in shipboard operations. Vera, on the other hand, massed approximately 4 tons and was currently demonstrating why the phrase "like a bull in a china shop" had survived humanity's transition to the stars. "Vera, sweetheart," Reynolds whispered into his throat mic. "Remind me again why we couldn't use the nice, spacious cargo bays?" The response came not through his earpiece, but through the neural link that connected every human Marine to their companion. It was a mixture of amused affection and patient explanation that somehow conveyed the tactical situation better than any briefing could have. Vera was a Terran Ursine, one of the genetically enhanced descendants of North American grizzly bears that had volunteered to join humanity's expansion into space. At 3 meters tall and built like a furry tank with an engineering degree, she was theoretically too large for stealth operations. In practice, she moved through the station's superstructure with the silent grace that came from millions of years of predatory evolution, enhanced by a century of human partnership. She was also, Reynolds reflected as they reached their objective, possibly the most intelligent person on the team. The maintenance shaft opened into a junction box that served as the nexus for this section of the station's power grid. While Reynolds checked his equipment, Vera was already examining the alien circuitry with the focused attention of someone who had spent decades learning to read the electrical signatures of a dozen different species. "Can you isolate the detention level?" Reynolds asked, watching his companion's massive claws manipulate circuits with surprising delicacy. Vera's response through their link was the equivalent of a confident nod, followed by what Reynolds had learned to recognize as her version of "watch this." She made 3 precise adjustments to the power routing, then sat back on her haunches with the satisfied expression of someone who had just solved a particularly elegant puzzle. The lights went out, not just in their immediate area. Throughout an entire section of the station, emergency lighting flickered on as the main power grid rerouted itself around Vera's modifications. In the detention levels below, cell doors that relied on magnetic locks suddenly found themselves without power. Phase 1 complete, Reynolds reported to his squad leader. "The package is unwrapped." 2 levels below, in the detention center's main corridor, the emergency lighting cast everything in hellish red shadows as Corvani guards scrambled to understand what was happening. The cells that had held 47 of the galaxy's most dangerous political prisoners, former war beasts whose awakening had triggered an interstellar crisis, were now standing open. Subcommander Crix stood in the center of the chaos, his 4 manipulator arms clicking with nervous energy as he tried to coordinate his forces. The detention center was supposed to be the most secure location on Nexus Station, buried deep in the station's core, surrounded by layers of security, staffed by guards who had been specifically trained to handle dangerous prisoners. None of that training had prepared them for what emerged from those open cells. The first Kithara to step into the corridor was a female that the Corvani records listed as Devastator Unit 7. Her bioluminescent strips pulsed with soft blue light as she stretched muscles that had been cramped in too small quarters for too long. When she spoke, her voice carried harmonics that seemed to resonate in the station's hull itself. Freedom smells different than memory promised. She was followed by another, then another, until the corridor was filled with 4-meter-tall predators whose eyes glowed with intelligence that no amount of conditioning had been able to completely suppress. They moved with the fluid coordination of pack hunters, taking positions that would allow them to support each other while covering multiple angles of approach. Crix raised his sidearm, a plasma projector designed to drop a Devastator in its tracks, and found himself looking into 47 pairs of glowing eyes. "Stand down," he chittered in the tone that had made Devastators cower for decades. "Return to your cells immediately or face termination." The Kithara looked at each other, then back at their former captor. Unit 7 tilted her massive head with an expression that might have been amusement. "We choose not to." The plasma bolt took her center mass, a shot that should have killed her instantly. Instead, she staggered backward 2 steps, looked down at the charred furrow in her chest armor, then looked back up at Crix with an expression that was definitely amusement. "That stings," she said conversationally. Then the pack moved. What followed wasn't a battle. It was an education. For decades, the Corvani had controlled their war beasts through pain, intimidation, and the systematic destruction of everything that made them who they were. They had turned magnificent predators into weapons that existed only to serve their master's will. But they had never fought Kithara, who remembered that they had a choice. The pack flowed through the detention center like water through a broken dam, moving with a coordination that spoke to millions of years of evolutionary refinement. They didn't kill indiscriminately. These were beings who had been forced to kill against their will for too long to take any pleasure in unnecessary violence. Instead, they disabled, contained, and moved on with the efficiency of creatures who had better things to do than waste time on revenge. Within minutes, the detention center was secure. But that was only the beginning. 3 levels above, in the council chambers, the emergency lighting cast dancing shadows across the faces of beings who represented the galaxy's most powerful civilizations. The power fluctuations had triggered lockdown protocols, sealing the diplomatic section of the station as security forces scrambled to maintain order. Supreme War Leader Vextar stood at the center of the chaos, his 4 eyes blazing with rage as he tried to coordinate a response to what was clearly a coordinated attack. Around him, the various delegations huddled in groups, their own security details forming protective perimeters that spoke to centuries of interspecies mistrust. Status report. Vextar barked into his communicator. "Sir," came the panicked voice of guard. "The human fleet has disabled our defense grid and launched boarding parties. We're detecting multiple intrusions throughout the station, but the attackers aren't following any recognizable tactical doctrine." "What do you mean?" "They're not targeting strategic locations, sir. They're targeting everything. It's like they know exactly where they want to go, and they're ignoring everything else." Vextar's mandibles clicked with frustration. Human military doctrine was supposed to be straightforward, overwhelming force applied to strategic objectives until the enemy surrendered. What his forces were reporting sounded more like a rescue operation than an invasion, which, he realized with growing dread, was probably exactly what it was. "Sir," another voice crackled through the comm, "we've lost contact with the detention center. The last report mentioned the prisoners had escaped, but that's impossible. The cells are magnetically sealed, and the transmission ended in a burst of static." Vextar stared at his communicator, then slowly looked around the council chamber. Every alien delegation was watching him with expressions that ranged from fear to anger to something that might have been satisfaction. In the corner, the human diplomatic staff sat calmly at their table as if nothing unusual was happening. Ambassador Peterson, Vextar's voice carried the dangerous undertone that preceded violence. Perhaps you would care to explain what your people think they're accomplishing. Ambassador Peterson, a distinguished man in his 70s who had spent decades defusing international crises, looked up from the datapad he had been reading with mild interest. I'm sorry, Supreme War Leader, were you speaking to me? I'm afraid I was rather absorbed in these energy readings. He held up the pad, showing what appeared to be a tactical display. Fascinating stuff, really. According to this, your station's defense grid has been completely neutralized. Your detention center is no longer responding to commands, and there are currently 47 large biological signatures moving through your maintenance systems. Peterson's voice remained conversationally pleasant, but something in his eyes suggested that his diplomatic career had involved more than just talking. Most interesting of all, he continued, is the fact that these signatures appear to be moving in coordinated groups towards specific objectives, almost as if they know exactly where they're going. That's impossible, Vextar snarled. Those creatures have been in isolation for decades. They have no knowledge of station layouts, but they do, Peterson interrupted gently. You see, that's the thing about pack animals, Supreme War Leader. They share information, and when you've been forcing them to live in the same facility for decades, they tend to learn quite a lot about their surroundings. As if summoned by his words, a new sound echoed through the council chamber, the deep, harmonious calls of creatures that had found their voices again. It was beautiful and terrible and utterly alien, the song of predators who had remembered that they were more than just weapons. But that's not the really interesting part, Peterson continued, his smile taking on an edge that made several delegations edge away from him. The really interesting part is what happens when you take pack hunters who have been separated from their family for 50 years and, suddenly, reunite them with cousins who've spent that same time learning to hunt between the stars. The chamber's main viewports suddenly blazed with light as something massive moved past them. Through the transparent aluminum, the watching delegations could see creatures that defied easy classification, beings that seemed to be part ship, part living organism, part something else entirely. They moved through space with the grace of dancers, and the purpose of sharks, circling the station in patterns that spoke to intelligence and intent. Ladies, gentlemen, and distinguished beings, Peterson said, rising from his chair with the dignity of a man who had just delivered a checkmate, I'd like you to meet the rest of the family. The lights flickered again, and this time when they came back up, the sealed doors of the council chamber were standing open. In the corridor beyond, emergency lighting illuminated shapes that were definitely not station security. Ambassador Chunwei walked into the chamber as if she were entering her own office, her diplomatic attire somehow unmarked despite whatever she had been through. Beside her, Marcus moved with the fluid grace of a creature that had finally remembered how to be free. Behind them came more Kithera, living beings whose eyes reflected intelligence, humor, and a kind of joy that no amount of conditioning had been able to destroy. Sorry we're late, Chunwei said pleasantly. We got a bit tied up in the detention center, but we're here now, and I think it's time we finished our conversation. She looked around the chamber, meeting the gaze of every delegation present. When she spoke again, her voice carried the authority of someone who had just fundamentally altered the balance of power in the galaxy. The age of conquest is over, she said simply. The age of partnership has begun, and anyone who wants to argue the point is welcome to take it up with the pack. Outside the viewports, more shapes moved through space. The combined fleets of humanity and their companions, creatures who had chosen to stand together against the darkness. It was the largest concentration of cooperative species the galaxy had ever seen, and they had come for one simple reason. Family was worth fighting for. And family, as the universe was about to learn, was much larger than anyone had imagined. 6 months after what historians would call the liberation of Nexus Station, Ambassador Chun Wei stood on the observation deck of the newly established Embassy of Species, watching ships from across the galaxy arrive for the most unusual diplomatic summit in recorded history. The massive space station that had once served as a symbol of Corvani dominance had been transformed into something unprecedented, a meeting place where predator and prey, hunter and guardian, leader and follower could come together as equals. Through the viewport, she could see Marcus playing with a group of young Kithara who had been born free, their bioluminescent strips pulsing with colors that had never been recorded in Corvani databases. They moved through the station's recreational areas with the joyful abandon of children who had never known fear, while their elders watched with expressions of wonder that Chun Wei suspected she would never tire of seeing. Remarkable, isn't it? The voice belonged to Dr. Sarah Kim, the xenobiologist who had been leading the rehabilitation efforts for the freed Kithara. A small woman with kind eyes and steady hands, she had somehow managed to earn the trust of beings who had every reason to distrust anyone who approached them with medical equipment. "What is?" Chun Wei asked, though she suspected she knew the answer. "How quickly they've adapted to freedom. We expected months of therapy, careful reintegration, possibly even violent outbursts as they processed what had been done to them." Dr. Kim gestured toward the viewport where Marcus was apparently teaching the youngsters some sort of game that involved coordinated movements and harmonic vocalizations. Instead, they've just moved on, like they were only waiting for someone to remind them who they really were. Chun Wei nodded slowly. In the months since the liberation, she had spent countless hours with Marcus and the other former devastators, learning about their culture and helping them reconnect with memories that 50 years of conditioning had tried to erase. What she had discovered was a species that understood forgiveness in ways that most sentient beings couldn't comprehend. "The Kithara don't believe in revenge," she said quietly. "Their entire worldview is built around the idea that every action should strengthen the pack. Holding grudges, seeking vengeance, those things weaken the bonds that keep a pack together, even after what was done to them." Chun Wei turned away from the viewport to face Dr. Kim directly. "Especially after what was done to them. They know what it costs to live without the pack. They're not about to waste time on anything that might threaten what they found here. What they had found here was something that no one had expected. Not the humans who had come to rescue their companions, not the Kithara who had been freed from slavery, and certainly not the galactic community that was still struggling to understand what had happened. They had found hope. The transformation had begun within hours of the liberation. As word spread through the galaxy that the Corvani's ultimate weapons had not only been freed, but had chosen to stand with humanity, species that had lived in fear for generations began to ask questions they had never dared voice before. What else were they afraid of that they didn't need to be? Who else might be waiting for someone to offer them a choice? How many potential partners were they overlooking because they couldn't imagine relationships built on anything other than dominance and submission? The answers had come slowly at first, then in a flood that had overwhelmed every diplomatic channel in known space. Species that had been conquered by the Corvani sent secret messages asking for help reclaiming their enslaved populations. Neutral worlds requested protection from empires that suddenly seemed far less invincible. Even former Corvani allies began quietly withdrawing support, unwilling to be associated with a regime whose crimes have been so thoroughly exposed. The Galactic Council, faced with the largest political crisis in recorded history, had done what bureaucracies always did when confronted with the impossible. They had formed a committee to study the situation. The committee had recommended immediate action to address the humanitarian crisis created by the revelation of Corvani slavery practices. Within a month, the first joint task forces had launched. Human ships working alongside vessels from the Thessarian Trade Collective, the Garonian Federation, and dozens of other species to locate and liberate enslaved populations throughout Corvani space. They had found devastator breeding facilities, conditioning centers, and research stations where beings that had once been free-thinking individuals had been systematically broken down and rebuilt as weapons. They had also found something else. Chun, Dr. Kim said, her voice pulling the ambassador back to the present. There's something you need to see. We've just received a transmission from the task force working in the Corvani's former research sector. Chun Wei followed the doctor to the station's communications center, where a holographic display showed Admiral Sarah Martinez's face. Even across the light years, the family resemblance was obvious, though the Admiral's expression carried a weight that spoke to recent experiences she would probably never fully discuss. Wei, Admiral Chamartinez said without preamble, we found them. The hologram shifted to show what appeared to be an entire solar system converted into a research facility. Massive orbital platforms surrounded a dead world, their surfaces bristling with laboratories and holding facilities that stretched beyond the horizon. In the space between them, transport ships moved like ants, carrying cargo that made Chun Wei's stomach clench. The Corvani weren't just enslaving Kithara, her sister continued. They've been doing this for over 1,000 years to dozens of species, maybe hundreds. We're looking at the largest crime against sentience in galactic history. The display zoomed in on one of the orbital platforms, showing holding cells that contained creatures Chun Wei didn't recognize. Some were clearly predators, beings with the powerful builds and keen senses that marked them as apex species on their home worlds. Others were more subtle, creatures whose intelligence shone in their eyes, even as their bodies showed the scars of genetic modification and surgical alteration. How many? Chun Wei asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. Conservative estimate? Over 10,000 individuals from at least 30 different species. Some of them have been in conditioning for so long that we're not sure they remember their original forms. Admiral Chamartinez's voice remained steady, but Chun Wei could hear the strain underneath. We're going to need more help. A lot more help. Chun Wei looked around the communications center, taking in the faces of the beings who had gathered to listen to the transmission. Humans, Thessarians, Garonians, even a few reformed Corvani who had broken with their empire when the truth came to light. 6 months ago, they had been separate species with their own agendas and concerns. Now, there was something else entirely. They were a pack. We'll send everything we have, she said. How long until the Liberation Fleet can be ready? 48 hours, assuming we can coordinate with the other task forces. Admiral Chamartinez paused, her expression softening slightly. Wait, there's something else. Something you need to prepare Marcus and the others for. The display shifted again, showing what appeared to be a nursery facility. Row upon row of incubation chambers filled a space the size of a city, each one containing developing creatures that would one day be forced into slavery. But that wasn't what made Chun Wei's breath catch. It was the fact that several of the chambers contained young Kithara. The Devastator program is still active, Admiral Chamartinez said quietly. They're still taking children, still breaking them. And some of those children, she didn't need to finish. Chunwei could see it in the data scrolling past on the secondary displays. Genetic markers that matched the Kithra who had been freed from Nexus Station. These weren't just random victims of a 1,000-year-old atrocity. They were Marcus's family. "I'll tell him," Chunwei said, her diplomat's training helping her keep her voice steady despite the emotions churning in her chest. "He has a right to know. We'll get them back, Wei. All of them. I promise you that." The transmission ended, leaving the communications center in silence. Around her, the assembled beings began to disperse, each carrying word of the discovery back to their own people. Within hours, the news would spread throughout the galaxy. The revelation that the Corvani's crimes were far worse than anyone had imagined, and that there were thousands of enslaved beings still waiting for freedom. Chunwei remained in the communications center, staring at the blank holographic display and thinking about promises, about family, about the responsibilities that came with being part of something larger than yourself. She was still there when Marcus found her, his massive form moving through the corridors with the careful grace of someone who had learned to navigate spaces designed for smaller beings. He settled beside her with the patient silence that she had come to associate with his species, waiting for her to speak when she was ready. "They found more," she said finally. Marcus's bioluminescent strips pulsed in a pattern she had learned to recognize as careful attention. "Others like us. Others like you." And she turned to face him, meeting those ancient, intelligent eyes. Children. Kithra children who are still in the conditioning process. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, Marcus went completely still. Then his bioluminescent strips began to pulse in a pattern Chunwei had never seen before. Complex, rapid shifts of color and intensity that seemed to carry meaning beyond words. "They're pack?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Some of them might be. We won't know until we can run genetic comparisons." Chunwei reached out to place a hand on his flank, feeling the power that thrummed beneath his biomodified hide. "Marcus, I need to ask you something, and I need you to understand that whatever you choose will support you." His great head turned toward her, those 4 eyes reflecting depths of emotion that no amount of conditioning had been able to touch. "The Liberation Fleet is preparing to leave for the research facilities. They could use guides who understand Corvani systems, who know how the conditioning process works." She took a breath. "They could use you and the others. But going back there, seeing what's being done to your people, won't be easy." Marcus was quiet for a long moment, his gaze turning toward the viewport where young Kithra played in the safety of the station. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of someone who had made a decision that would echo through generations. "The pack protects the cubs," he said simply. "Always." Chunwei felt tears threaten at the corners of her eyes. Tears of pride, of grief, of hope for what might be possible when beings chose to stand together instead of apart. "Then we go together," she said. "All of us. Human and Kithra, predator and protector, hunter and guardian." She stood, feeling the weight of responsibility settle on her shoulders like a familiar coat. "We bring them home." Outside the viewport, the ships of a dozen species moved through space with the coordinated grace of creatures who had learned to hunt as one. They were no longer separate fleets pursuing separate agendas. They were a pack, bound together by something stronger than treaties or alliances. They were bound by the understanding that family was worth fighting for, that freedom was worth the risk, and that the universe was large enough for everyone to find their place in it. The age of conquest was ending. The age of partnership had begun. And somewhere in the darkness between the stars, 10,000 enslaved beings waited for the sound of someone calling them home. they wouldn't have to wait much longer. The pack was coming. 3 weeks later, Chun Wei stood on the bridge of the Liberation Fleet flagship, watching through the main viewport as the Corvani research facilities burned. Not with the fires of destruction, but with the light of liberation. Ships from across the galaxy working together to dismantle the machinery of slavery that had operated in secret for centuries. In the medical bays below, beings who had forgotten their own names were remembering who they had been before the conditioning began. In the nursery sections, children who had never known freedom were taking their first steps into a universe where they could choose their own paths. And in the observation lounge, Marcus sat surrounded by young Kithara who called him uncle and begged him to tell them stories about the time before, when their people had been shepherds of vast herds under alien skies. You know, Admiral Chamartinez said, joining her sister at the viewport, 6 months ago, if someone had told me we'd be running the largest rescue operation in galactic history with the help of reformed war criminals and talking space whales, I'd have recommended them for psychological evaluation. Chun Wei smiled, watching as another transport full of freed beings docked with one of the rehabilitation ships. And now I'm wondering why it took us so long to figure out that the universe works better when everyone has a choice about where they belong. In the distance, the last of the Corvani research stations went dark. Its purpose ended forever. But that wasn't the end of the story, it was the beginning. Because across the galaxy, beings who had spent lifetimes in isolation were learning that they didn't have to face the darkness alone. They were learning that there were others who would stand beside them, not because they were forced to, but because they chose to. They were learning what it meant to be part of the pack. And the pack, as the universe was discovering, was always ready to welcome new members home.